Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Taiwan Studies Program New Book Talk series. My name is James Lin. I am Assistant Professor of International Studies here at the Jackson School, as well as Associate Chair of the Taiwan Studies Program. So this afternoon, we have a very special talk, special because it's actually a part of a larger event that we're having for the next 2 days at the University of Washington, and this is the workshop Pioneering Taiwan Studies. Along with my co-organizers, Nikki Alsford, Nikki's in the back there, as well as Bill Lavely. We are bringing together in this workshop several generations of early scholars, mostly anthropologists, who went to Taiwan in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s to do field work and to learn about Taiwanese society. All of the presenters of the workshop are here in our audience today, so this is a very special kind of audience moment that we'll have hopefully some exciting questions during the Q&A. Our honored guest speaker today is our very own Dr. Jing Xu. Professor Xu is an anthropologist from University of Washington, Seattle. She holds a BA and MA from Tsinghua University and a PhD in anthropology from Washington University in St. Louis. Her work examines the fundamental question of how humans become moral persons, an interdisciplinary approach that puts anthropological and psychological theories in conversation and integrates ethnographic, experimental, and computational methods. Her research spans several geographic regions and historical periods, including contemporary China, martial law era Taiwan, and cross-cultural comparative contexts. Her first book was The Good Child, Moral Development in a Chinese Preschool, published by Stanford University Press in 2017. Today, she'll be talking about her newly published book, which I think is arriving in the mail just today, Unruly Children, Historical Field Notes and Learning Morality in a Taiwan Village, Cambridge University Press 2024. So our format for today is Jing will speak for 35, 40, 45 minutes or so, after which the audience will have an opportunity to ask her questions as part of the Q&A period. Unfortunately, I have to leave before the Q&A, so I have enlisted my colleague, Professor Yize Li, who is a visiting Fulbright scholar here at UW for the year from National Donghua University in Taiwan. He's very kindly agreed to serve as the moderator for the Q&A session. So as usual, those of you who are joining us online, feel free to leave questions in YouTube. Dr. Li will be able to see those questions and ask them of Dr. Xu. Without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Xu with a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's such a great honor for me to be speaking here, not only because it is the official publication date of my new book, Unruly Children. Unruly, I have to emphasize in quotation marks, which I will explain in a few minutes. But especially in this occasion, I'm joined by all these very important people who have helped me in this project and even made this possible. I have Hill Gates, Professor Hill Gates, who kindly granted me this unique access of her late husband, Arthur Wolf's field notes archive. And also she wrote afterward for this new book. And also to Professor Stephen Harrell, who introduced me to this project and wrote a foreword for my book. And also John, thank you so much for your glowing praise, which is going to be on the back cover of my book. So this book is freshly published by Cambridge University Press as part of the series called New Departures in Anthropology, and it's dedicated to the memory of Arthur Wolf. So today I'm going to first briefly introduce my research program and angle, sort of situate my research in the larger intellectual debates. Then I will zoom in and talk about the new book and historicize it because it's a very special ethnography, unconventional. And I will use the story of children's vice to illustrate the central arguments of my book, Humans Become Moral Persons, and examine the questions through telling stories of children. I am fascinated by children because they present a great mystery, voracious learners the universe has ever seen, including learning abstract knowledge such as moral norms and cultural values. But children's voices are hard to discern and interpret in their lived experience, often obscured in scholarly work. Hope my research presents one way to tell their stories, and through telling their stories, examine fundamental questions about humanity. Through studying moral development, my research creates dialogue between anthropology and psychology to understand how culture, and human mind constitute each other. Grounded in ethnography, my research also incorporates quantitative and computational methods to advocate methodological pluralism in anthropology. Also, underneath methodological explorations are more epistemological reflections about how knowledge come into being. And my research also, I have examined different age groups from infancy to adolescence and looked at different spatial temporal contexts. I try to combine multiple levels of analysis from human cognition, which is at the more individual level, to institutions such as family and schools, and to larger social change. And recently, I've been starting more cross-cultural comparative work, which I'll be happy to talk more in the Q&A session. I just saw that my husband is here. I want to give him a special acknowledgement. He has been hearing me talking about the children in these field notes forever, thanking him for being here. So more than 2 decades ago, a provocative article was published in the journal American Anthropology called "Why Don't Anthropologists Like Children?" And Larry Hirschfeld, a cognitive anthropologist, he points out the paradox. Although children they have a remarkable capacity for learning and learning knowledge. In particular, mainstream anthropology works rarely put children at the theoretical center. And I will say this problem exists and persists not only in anthropology, but also in area studies and social sciences more broadly. Even when we talk about children, it's not like we don't like talking about children. When we do talk about children, we tend to emphasize sort of a top-down perspective of parenting, socialization. We talk about ideologies, discourses, and representations about children rather than children themselves. I think this bias reflects 2 popular assumptions about the child's mind. First of all, that the child's mind is a black box. Therefore, the mental processes bear no relevance to understanding society or culture. The second assumption is that child's mind is a blank slate. They just absorb whatever it is in the environment. My research rejects these assumptions because there are sort of impoverished views of learning which obscure the complexity and significance of child development. To situate my scholarship a bit more in the recent intellectual movements and recent cognitive science research in the past couple of decades have explored fundamental questions of human existence, such as morality, cooperation, intelligence, and increasingly focused on child development. A recent review paper, as you can see on the left word cloud, that sampled the important papers on cross-cultural research of the human mind, and the #1 high-frequency word in the titles and abstract is children. You can see other words too, moral, learning, and other keywords. However, these studies tend to prioritize controlled experiments and quantitative analysis. They lack ethnographic perspectives on children's lived experience in actual context. My research program addresses this problem by studying moral development through ethnography and bringing critical reflections on psychological concepts. My first book focused on preschool children in contemporary Shanghai in the 2010s, which sort of established my expertise in this interdisciplinary frontier. My second book turns to a new direction. It focuses on children in a mid-20th century Taiwanese village. It is a unique reanalysis of a rare and significant archive of field notes collected by the late anthropologists Arthur and Marjorie Wolfe. Now, let's look at Unruly Children. Field notes that my book is based on belong to Arthur Wolfe, the products of his dissertation fieldwork in Taiwan in the late 1950s, from 58 to 60. He was among the first American anthropologists to go to Taiwan, and his then wife, Marjorie Wolfe, joined him for the field trip. And they did over 2 years of fieldwork in a village near Taipei called Xiaxizhou at the height of Taiwan's martial law era. And the villagers were mostly Benshengren, Hoklo-speaking people. And this is what the village looked like when Arthur first entered the community. And then this is a village map that my students and I recreated based on the pencil drawing drawn by Arthur. You can see the blue is the river, and there are alleys and canals, and there are rice paddy, and there are a lot of households clustered together. Imagine that the protagonists of my book, the little children, they're just running around in the rice paddy and bamboo grove, vegetable groves, climbing trees, playing hide and seek. After the long pandemic years, I finally got a chance to visit this original field site. Fortunately, I mean, the entire village now is part of Xinbei, New Taipei City, is urbanized. But then the old house that Arthur and Marjorie once stayed for over 2 years is still there, which is a house of Lin, actually, that their old house. Now nobody lives there. And this village, under the pseudonym Beihetian, is an iconic landmark in the map of sinological anthropologists. I'm quoting Morris Friedman here. From this initial field trip to Taiwan, Arthur and Marjorie, they launched their distinguished careers. And this field trip also played a significant role in their influential publications on kinship, marriage, family, women, and gender. Many of us who are familiar with the Wolf's works, however, did not know that their original research subjects were children and child rearing, because Arthur didn't get a chance to systematically publish from this trove of field notes. In August 2018, I first visited this archive at the residence up in Sonoma County mountains. And this project also has a significant place in multiple streams of intellectual history. It is the first anthropological study of ethnic Han children, and it is also an improved replication of the sixth culture study of child socialization, which was a landmark project in 1950s American anthropology. They sent teams to 6 different places to study children and child rearing, and people in many different disciplines are reviving the legacy of the 6 cultures today by using mixed methods and doing cross-cultural comparative research to study child development through a collaboration between anthropology and psychology. The Wolf's project has a much improved methodology. It has longer fieldwork time, much larger sample size, and with added methods that he localized according to the fieldwork situation. And at that time, this village has about 600 people, and there are more than 200 children from age 0 to 12, which is the age range that my book is focused on. I call this corpus of field notes the Wolf Archive. When I first encountered these original notes in the range up in the mountains, they were preserved in 3x5 typewritten cards and then copied. I scanned the following materials: the very systematic demographic and household information of this whole village. And then the core part of data, which is so rare to find in anthropological evidence, is timed child observation of more than 1,600 episodes. Then there are also other standardized methods: child interview, mother interview, and also mother observation. And Arthur also brought 2 projective tests. At the time, it's popular for an anthropologist to use psychological tests in fieldwork, TIT and doll play, which I will show in a little bit. I also want to emphasize that several Taiwanese research assistants played an enormously important role in collecting these data. So my work is not just to analyze the data per se, but to recover the story of the fieldwork itself, which include, among others, the voices of these research intermediaries. And the most important research assistant is MC, shorthand for Miss Chen. She was, at the time, was a teenager girl who was trusted by all villagers, old and young. The children called her older sister Chen and really liked to play with her. You can see this is a lively scene of participant observation, I would say. And thanks to her rapport with children, her devotion and excellent memory, we get to see such vivid, rich, and detailed observations. And this is a sample of child observation. As you can see, each person is assigned a unique number. Here we have 5, 6, and 7. There are a group of siblings belonging to the same household. And then every episode is also indexed by the date, time, location, and the person IDs. These precious field notes afforded me the opportunity to write a non-conventional ethnography, but it also presented a sort of existential challenge for me as an ethnographer. How can I ever reconstruct an ethnography of a world that I'm not familiar with, and the world that cannot go back to without first-person fieldwork experience? So I kept thinking about this question in the process of doing this project. What is field notes? Therefore, this book has a unique duality. It is simultaneously probing two questions. The primary question concerns how children learn morality, and the secondary question pertains to the nature of knowledge, how anthropologists make ethnography. And I connect these two questions in light of children's social cognition. That is, social cognition means how humans perceive, understand, and evaluate the social world. I argue that social cognition provides the foundation both for learning morality and for ethnographic meaning making. Moreover, I interpret these old field notes in new lenses. I explored a novel methodology that was unavailable 6 decades ago, and I used a theoretical framework that was distinct from what motivated my predecessors' research. In thinking about what is field notes and what can I do about these field notes, I was encouraged by earlier anthropologists' reflections. In this 1990 edited volume called Field Notes, Margaret Wolf actually contributed a chapter in that she envisioned that many years later, an anthropologist of a younger generation came to re-examine the Taiwan field notes. The anthropologist might be confused. Is it really hard to contextualize everything without first-person experience? But then, however challenging it might be, Margaret Wolf says it's still worth it, as she argued, because field notes can be re-examined for what they are, our feeble attempts at communication with one another. So in this spirit of communication, I began my journey of this book project. And from raw data to a book, the journey it actually involves layers of transcription, translation, and interpretation. But the systematic nature of this archive afforded me the opportunity to really take advantage of new technology and experiment a human-machine hybrid approach. So a crucial part of this project is actually digital humanities. To build a digital database from typewritten notes, to transcribe these notes into machine-readable files, and then build a database that can systematically index every page of note based on these variables. In terms of analysis, I also experimented a new methodology, which was grounded in ethnographic close reading, but I added natural language processing, including large language models and social network analysis, thanks to the systematic person IDs and demographic information, as well as behavioral coding, which is sort of originated from my training in psychology. And using this methodology is also to pay tribute to Arthur Wolf, who he's a rare figure in anthropology who pursued scientific rigor in his research. I also used a new theoretical framework based on my training in cognitive anthropology. As I mentioned earlier, the sixth culture study was motivated by a popular behaviorist paradigm at the time, which assumes children sort of passively assimilating culture and emphasize a reward punishment stimulus response learning. 6 decades later, my reanalysis starts from a different set of assumptions. First of all, we have known so far that young children have more complex mental life and capacity than the behaviorists once assumed. And also they develop such powerful social cognition in attunement with their context. And children, they also make meanings in their daily interaction. Therefore, I examine these materials in a framework that differs from my predecessors. A dominant model in the study of Han families is child training. So Margaret Wolf has an article with this title in the 1970s edited volume, Child Training, which actually is very behaviorist, which treats the child primarily as an object being molded by external forces, especially parenting. In contrast, I see children as agents and they focus on their active learning. Also, this paradigm shift leads me to rethink many assumptions we had about the so-called traditional Han family. One example is the training of obedience, which I will talk about later. And more generally, while my predecessors were hoping to discover patterns of traditional late imperial China traditional society, I try to historicize children's life in the context of the martial law era. But I have to say, we are all prisoners of our own time, and this is sort of a reflection of intellectual history. So I want to introduce you, this is a table of contents of the content chapter of 2 different books. On the left is Arthur. He was trying to write a book out of the earlier notes he collected, and he left a couple of introductory chapters which have been immensely helpful for me. But the table of contents looked quite different from the book I wrote. So he organized this book around the types of data. What did children say is child interview? What did children do is child observation? What did mother say is mother interview? What did mother do is mother observation? And I didn't read this table of contents until much later. I was about to submit my manuscript. I'm glad I didn't read it, but my book turned out quite different from the title to the way I organized the chapters. So my chapters are each chapter taken together, they all focus on children. But each chapter weaves together different types of data and also try to not only point out the question of learning morality, but also establish a conversation between me and the earlier researchers and their research intermediaries. And the title Unruly Children captures, again in quotation marks, captures my main thesis. So from an adult point of view, I see disobedient children defying parental commands, and they're not deterred by punishment. And this points to the limits of the socialization paradigm, which is a more conventional framework both in academia and the public discourse. But when we shift to the vantage point of a developing child, I see the opposite of unruly. I see children that are navigating cooperation and conflict and all the gray areas in between. And they were negotiating their own rules with very complex moral reasoning and sentiments, taking shape in a very specific historical context. I want to say a little bit more about the cover photo. It hints at my book's duality. You see that it's about 2 children playing together outside parental supervision and against parenting precept, because they were advised not to go play at the riverside because it's dangerous, they can be drowned. But yet you see they're playing very happily. And beyond that, it also encapsulates this intersubjective nature of ethnography. We see is a mutual gaze between the photographer, Arthur Wolf, the ethnographer, and his research interlocutors. And this prompts us to think how knowledge is made. Now I'm going to move on to the story of children's fights. And I mainly draw from 2 content chapters, chapter 2 and chapter 3. But over the board, children's fights emerged as a core theme across different types of data. And I used several methods to analyze it. And I want to make 3 points from the story of children's fight. One concerns what is field notes, and the second one is about learning morality. The last one is kind of a more methodological and epistemological reflections. About first of all, I want to introduce this cultural model of parenting against child fighting, which has been quite popular in this and some neighboring communities, which is sort of conducive to the ideal of neighborly harmony, because children's fights can disrupt adults' relationships between households. And then to prevent children's fighting, there's parents will intervene timely, and they will exert harsh punishment, and they will only tell children do not fight back. This can be seen in multiple streams of evidence, including mother interviews and including ethnographies from the same era. However, their responses in standardized interview posed a great contrast to the cultural model. For example, this is a child interview conducted by MC, their trusted favorite Miss Chen, and in a more relaxed setting. And it asks, suppose another child your age comes up and hits you, what would you do? Or what if the child hit you easy, and what if the child really sucked you? The take-home message is children, in their answers, they were quite sensitive to the severity of the aggression and all that. They were reciprocating, and much against the parental precept of no fighting. They were not hesitant to fight. In their narrative, they're not hesitant to fight back. And this is from 74 children ages 3 to 12. And then this is some sort of a qualitative taste of their narrative. Hit him with a bench, slap him, tell my father to buy a gun and shoot him, and you wonder if it's fantasy or some sort of reflects their actually what they're thinking and would do. But before I answer that question, I want to contrast that with 2 different kinds of narratives. So this is a school questionnaire, and Arthur and his assistant, well, I think Ms. Huang Jieshan, they designed this questionnaire, and in the latest phase of fieldwork, summer 1960, and administered in local elementary schools. There is a question that's very similar to the one asked in child interview. But as you can see in the video clip that I showed earlier in the panel, Arthur's talk at Academia Sinica, he said, I had the greatest difficulty to get the children to admit that they would, under any circumstances, ever hit back. So the standard answer is, I feel like it doesn't matter, which means that children knew the normative expectations. I will explain why, the contrast. The third type of materials is their spontaneous storytelling from psychological tests. This is a TAT, the upper three pictures, and that is doll play. Basically, this is some sort of pictures and drawings, and to elicit children's spontaneous narratives about what is happening. Kind of their imagination, but very reality-based. Use quantitative and qualitative methods, fighting emerged as a very salient theme. Children will say, oh, they were fighting, they will be punished by their parents, and will hit very harshly, and police will be involved, so on and so forth. These are kind of ambiguous situations, but fighting is always the sort of pivot in these narratives. So this leads to me to ask, what is the nature of field notes? Why are children saying different things under different circumstances? I want to say that we should understand field notes as communicated products between social minds. First, let's look at the making of field notes. Child interview was looking at explicit first-person attitude, whereas school questionnaire, as many of you understand way better than me, these children were growing up in a system, in a school system. They were, at the time, they were not allowed to speak Taiwanese. They were only allowed to speak Mandarin, and teachers and everybody was very strict. Also, Arthur Wolf was the one asking the questions in Mandarin, and the children in the notes, scattered around, they were a little bit afraid of the foreigners. They were, which is not rare. So they were very smart to tell the right answer. Whereas projective tests was done in a different setting by a different research assistant, but it's about third person, right? It's not asking how you would react. So it's eliciting their implicit knowledge and attitude. Taken together, we see that field notes were shaped by children developing social cognition, acute sensitivity to their communicative contexts, partners, and intentions. And the lesson for anthropologists, for me to learn, is in order to make sense of these field notes, we have not only to attune to a context, which anthropologists are perfectly aware of, and where we have been doing that for a long time, but also appreciate the workings of the social mind, which is something I want to emphasize more. Now let's proceed to the second point about children's fighting, which is turning the framework from child training to active learning. So this is, to answer the question, to what extent is that children's fantasy or is actually their actual behavior? I analyzed child observation in a very systematic way. I want to emphasize 2 points. The context of these texts. First of all, the observer MC, she was really trusted by the observed. So the children were very relaxed. They even sometimes complained that, why don't you come play with us? Why are you just taking notes and, observing what we are doing? And it was also important to know that she was observing spontaneous social interactions rather than, okay, today I'm going to focus on fighting, so I'm going to observe all the fighting scenario. So we get a bit more of a sort of a random sample, if you will. And long story short, I developed a coding system for over 30 themes and over 12,000 entries, sort of sentence by sentence, including initiator, recipient, and intensity of the behavior and the theme of behavior. But the conclusion to draw is the special theme, physical aggression. Over 80% of all the children involved in appeared in the child observation, they were involved one way or another in physical aggression. We're talking about physical aggression, not just playful, light sort of scenarios. And 20% of the episodes have it as a central theme. And these behavioral details, some of them were consistent with their responses in child interview. and also to utilize new analytical methods and to make the most of this rich and systematic archive. I collaborated with a biostatistician graduate student here at the UW to use more fancy modeling methods. It's a mouthful, multi-level, multinomial behavioral modeling to really tease apart different, like how, for example, in the case of physical aggression, how is physical aggression related to other behaviors, their demographic effects, and household effects, and all that. We're also doing, I include a little bit of social network analysis and data in the book, but we're doing more elaborate, sophisticated analysis of social network and including behavior and demographic variables. So this is a naughty boy number 7, the red square, and number 172, which I will talk about in a little bit. She's a kind of naughty leadership girl. The yellow color, the sort of the connections are more negative interactions such as physical aggression. But then the gist is these behavioral patterns together with their own narratives present a puzzle that is the disobedient child. Why are children not deterred and they do not listen to these precepts and they're not deterred by punishment? And this leads to my main argument in chapter 2, that is we should shift from the parenting perspective to focus on their active learning. In terms of punishment, to many Taiwanese parents at the time, punishment works in a straightforward behaviorist fashion. You punish, you incur costs, and you induce fear. And parents believe that hitting would really induce fear and then therefore control, 管, and to achieve child obedience. However, from a cognitive perspective, inspired by some new theories in moral psychology, actually children or anybody, we would respond to punishment as a communicative signal to be inferred, to be interpreted, and to be, there's a more complex process going on. And then when we shifted to children's perspective, I did find that they brought in their own inferences and the emotions at the situation, and they not only interpret the parents' sort of intentions, but also evaluate whether parents were justified to do that punishment. And their emotions are more than just fear. There's anger, there's humiliation, sometimes there's even humor, as you can see in the next slide. And I want to just say a little bit more. I don't have time to go into detail in this presentation, but happy to discuss in the Q&A. Beyond parenting, peer play is also a very important sort of way for children to learn morality, and they can gossip about their parents, they can mock their parents. This is one episode of mocking authority is my conclusion, but they're playing a game called Mom Spanking Child. So 172 is that round orange node in one of the social network graphs. She was 8-year-old. She was playing mother and she was running around and spanking all the children. She was playing a game with her siblings and children from other households. And these other younger children were like pretending they were so scared. Oh, mother is coming. And then this 172 was like, you dead child, and mimicking, what's happening in their daily life. And it's such a hilarious episode. And it's kind of fascinating to see how children, they channel their discontent toward punishment and authority into humor, sarcasm, and amusement. But it also points to the importance of observational learning in children's development in general. Parental punishment is just one form of violence that children observe in their daily life. But beyond the intimate family context, they also get to see a lot of other things and exposed to things that only make sense in the larger political and historical context of martial law Taiwan. For example, policing in the larger context, gangsters in the local community. I don't have time to elaborate on this, but definitely would love to talk more with this group of audience. And this brings me to the last lesson from the story of children's fighting. The last point I want to make, that is the problem of meaning. How do we historians anthropologists or whoever, how do we interpret behavior via text? And I chose a human-machine hybrid approach for various reasons, but it leads me to ask new questions. So a very basic thing we can do to use text mining analysis is to look at the frequency of words, right, in this corpus after cleaning this corpus. And what I found is that you can see there are a lot of verbs: run, go, play. It gives you a sense of a taste of what children's world was like. And the words hit and yell also ranked really high. And it might potentially point to the saliency of children's fights, but not necessarily, because words are ambiguous. For example, the word hit can mean I hit you, or can mean I'm hitting a stone, playing with a dog, or something like that. Can also mean they're in a pretend play situation, not really hitting. And that has implication for my findings. So I use a more advanced natural language machine learning method called topic modeling. And the basic idea is, without any supervision from the human expert, these algorithms just they discover latent patterns through clusters of high-frequency words that co-occur together, which might potentially point to important topics that are hard to discern by the human eye. Anyway, one of the topics these algorithms told me really looks like child fighting. You can see these are the high-frequency words: hit, verbs, and emotional words: angry, angrily, and some curse words, which those of you who've been to Taiwan at that time in the countryside, probably not. It's a familiar thing. And beyond topic modeling, we also tried the cutting-edge large language models through collaboration with the data scientist who's now at Microsoft. So the basic idea, I will explain this, is based on my ethnographic expertise and the results we got from topic modeling. We created a list of keywords under 6 topics that I'm interested in that are also salient in the local context: family, school, shopping, play, and conflict, and cooperation. Then we fine-tuned SentenceBird, SBird, one of the Google large language models, to create high-dimensional vectors that represent these 6 themes. On the left, we also resort to large language models as SBird and represent each episode of field notes in child observation as a high-dimensional vector. And then we calculate the similarity, semantic similarity. Cosine similarity is a very common way in natural language processing to see the similarity between these 2 groups of vectors, which can potentially tell us what are the salient themes in one given observation. So to briefly explain the result, each row represents a episode, child observation document, text, and each column is a theme, the theme vector. So these are theme vector, these are the field observation vector, and ignore the actual numbers because these are normalized, so they all added up to 1 in each row. But what you do want to care about is the darker the color of a cell, it means the darkest color means the dominant, sort of a more dominant theme in this episode. And added together, we can clearly see play and conflict seem like the 2 most important themes in this archive. So the large language models are doing a great job so far. They captured the sort of basic textures in this archive. However, I found one tricky problem. There are indeed a lot of children's fights, conflict, but then there are also a lot of playful teasing. But then some of the playful teasing and fighting might have confused, using a very human term to describe large language models. But for example, this is a common scenario in children's life: dueling. It's pretend conflict. As you can see, there is words like, oh, you die, but it doesn't mean that you literally die. And it's a very playful scenario. But on the bottom, we can see that SBird actually treated conflict through the similarity scores. Conflict had the highest score instead of play or cooperation, which means LLM didn't get it right in some scenarios. And this leads me to ponder about the nature of human children and human intelligence and human sociality. Because AI had a hard time making sense of children's pretend fight. For children, however, for them it's so natural, so easy, it's ubiquitous, it's in every human society. Children start out doing a lot of pretend play, including pretend fights. When we think about it, it's not actually that easy. It is very ambiguous. It involves layered intentionality, and it blurs cooperation and conflict. I'm actually doing further play with large language models and sometimes consulting my husband, who's a software engineer, and trying to write more about this because it's just fascinating what these nodes, the implications of these mundane nodes. And a further comparison is about human versus artificial intelligence can be broken down to two parts. First of all, learning morality. How do children learn playful fights? It points to the fascinating puzzle of human mind, children's mind specifically, as today many developmental psychologists are collaborating with computer scientists to figure out the key to invent so-called general intelligence, machine and whatnot, and they go to children to find the ultimate answer. Because children from a very young age develop the core of social cognition, which is TOM, theory of mind, which is that we humans know how to interpret other people's intentions, beliefs, desires, mental states that are different from our own. And then they also bringing moral specific, domain specific moral cognition and emotion into their playful fights. And they're also bringing a lot of cultural meaning into that. They were playing funerals, they were playing bye-bye, they were playing drinking parties, so on and so forth. But most crucial points, children, they require very small training data compared to all the, language AI and whatnot. And these playful fights, play in general is intrinsically fun. And that's something the machines, I don't know when, maybe hopefully they will never catch up. But the other side of this question is how do we, machine or humans, interpret children's playful fights? This gets the question of the nature of ethnography. Because even if I didn't do this fieldwork by myself, after immersing myself in these texts, I can discern what is playful fight versus what is not almost instantaneously, whereas some of these playful fights still confuse large language models who are, this deep neural networks and whatnot. It means that the ways children learn to discern layered intentions, cultural meanings, and moral sentiments are exactly the foundation for the kind of deep knowledge and thick description, which the thing we call ethnography. So taken together, field notes of children's everyday social life can pose profound questions for anthropologists and behavioral scientists more broadly. So let me wrap up. The take-home message for the entire book is to urge us, anthropologists or all the people, to take children seriously. As my research demonstrates, studying children can answer very important theoretical questions about what is morality, what is learning, and what it means to be human. And also this very unconventional project that I'm so lucky to embark on got me think a lot about, through methodological exploration, about the problem of meaning and sort of more epistemological concerns about the nature of fieldwork and ethnography. And leads me to think that all the texts humans produced are produced by social minds, the communication between social minds in context. So whatever method we use, whatever disciplinary background we come from, we need to be really careful to interpret and reflect on how do we know what we know. And lastly, precisely because there's so many unanswered questions about human children, and studying them require us to embrace a more sort of eclectic and interdisciplinary vision and to have more open dialogue with other fields. Before I end the talk, I want to do a small plug because we're desperately looking for research volunteers, I'm doing a new project which involves recruiting families, Mandarin speaking, who have children who have at least one parent who's a native Mandarin speaker in the greater Seattle area. This also is about childhood learning and child rearing and development. And it's funded by UK's Economic and Social Research Council. And every participating child can get a $25 gift card. And it's approved by UW IRB. So whoever is interested, if you are watching this from online, please scan and sign up or spread the word. Lastly, I want to extend my deepest gratitude to many important people who are here, to Hill Gates, to Steve, John, and James. I forgot to acknowledge. He's my teacher of modern Taiwan's history at the University of Washington, and all the research assistants and many colleagues at the University of Washington. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Xu, for this very provocative and interesting talk. Now the floor is open. Oh, my name is Yizi Li. I'm in the position of host at this moment when James is away. So floor is open.
So there's kind of two points, and it may well be that it's discussed in the book and just don't have an awareness. One is that with the photographic evidence that you have of the children, have you considered trying to get hold of them as adults, as a way of having conversations about their recollections of playful fighting, whether they really did want them to die or just words? And the second thing, and obviously I know that you've taken the ethnography from the field notes, but whether you took the consideration of social class into this, as you know, these are children in a rural area, and whether or not that you thought that would this be the same or would it be different? Like what kind of flavor would that take on if this was a study done of children in Taipei City, for example?
Right. Yeah, thank you, Nikki. Those are great questions about the photographs and following up. It's very interesting. I did go to, it's not a village anymore, the area where Xiaxizhou, the village, used to be last year, end of September. And thanks to Steve, who introduced me to Mr. Wang Shijing's son, who brought me to the field. And actually, it's very interesting. He met me in Taipei, and we went on the train to Shulin, and he brought me, and we met with village elders. One of the people might be original participants in this research, and we walked on the road that is less sort of developed, but that was the street that Arthur took many years ago. So he wanted me to sort of recreate. Well, you can never go back in time, but that was his intention. I was so warmly greeted by a lot of elderly people in that. They have a cultural center, and they were in charge of the temple, and all that. Arthur donated money to that Tudigong in the temple, and some of the people were original participants. A few. One is the House of Lim, the one household, the Arthur landlord's son. He was one of the. He was maybe 7 or something like that when the research was done. So their fond memory. When I told Ms. Wang Mongliang, Mr. Wang Shiqing's son, and I would like to talk to anybody who knew of the research, or who were part of the research, and I showed him the photo of doll play. I didn't have to go through that in the talk, but this was so Arthur did a really great job. He localized these standard psychological tests, which was used by American anthropologists, quite popular at the time. He hired local artists to make this. This is a photo of the doll house. It's sort of similar to a typical farmhouse you'd see at the time, with the figures like grandmother, father, mother, and siblings. You see a lot of children in one. Is a high fertility at the time, and they were so happy to see this. They remember. This triggered their memory, and the most exciting thing they remembered was candies, because they could have candies after doing the doll play. And reminded me of what John, you said earlier, that how research happened, how certain interesting finding emerged. That Arthur, maybe they were doing this doll play with some children, and one of the girls broke down in tears because she was adopted little girl, and this is a family scene. I guess is the doll play. So that is one interesting thing I learned, and I'm actually going to Taipei very soon in a couple of weeks, and I hope to reconnect with some of these elderly people, and then maybe do some oral history interview. And one other funny anecdote is, in the 90s, Arthur went back to the village, and it was not a village anymore, even at that time. And somebody recognized him, Wu Lao Shi, and they gathered some of the participants who are at the time parents already, not children, and asked about their memory of the research, which I wrote about in chapter 1, Fieldwork Beyond Fieldwork. And the children all remembered that they were asked to, play to get a urine sample in the middle of the night and other things. And also the children, their fond memory of this project. This was from Arthur himself in his recollection from the 1990s trip, that children were basically playing anthropologists. They invented a game called Didi Dada. They were typing. They were like, what are the anthropologists doing? They're just asking questions and typing on the typewriter. So all the children were doing this speaking of pretend play, one asking question, the other typing. And and I saw in the oral history book that Dominic edited, Mara Cohen also remembered that the kids were so curious. They kind of followed him everywhere and see how he typed up notes. That was so absurd, you have to think from a child's perspective at the time. So there are lots of these tiny stories, but the answer is yes. And I do want to do more follow-up research or interview at least. And about social class, that is such an important issue. I can immediately tell you, now that I'm doing a project in Seattle, there are a lot of wealthy, I go to East Side, because there are a lot of, I don't know why, people who sign up, they mostly come from East Side, the wealthy neighborhood of software engineers, families. And I was following one girl, 6-year-old girl, doing one-on-one golf lesson. That was the first time I was immersed in a 2 hours golf lesson. I was carrying a camera and then just following around. I was immediately thinking about, we have a collaborator, they were collecting data in Congo, hunter-gatherer, and also a farming community. How different on earth are different worlds children are living, speaking of social class. And they have more children, and they have much less parental supervision. That is one of the reasons why in the 1990s, Steve's graduate student, Maria Duray, yeah, she went back to the community. She wanted to replicate the interviews and observations. She could do some interviews with the original participants, but there's no way you can do a sort of a communal observation like this. That's why this data is very precious, because in the 90s, children were living in apartment buildings, units, and then they don't play, they don't climb trees without any supervision, just going by to the riverside and just playing by themselves. And whereas in this scenario, it's mostly older siblings taking care of younger siblings, and maybe a lot of cousins and friends. So it's a very, very different scenario. And I would like to learn more from tomorrow's panel on class, Hill and Steve. Thank you.
Quickly repeat. So Professor Yang has an observation that this research will have an interesting comparison about raising a child and an AI training process. And the question basically is about the research assistant in the field, at the field side, her background, and also some description about her in the field notes that is possibly understood.
Great. Thank you, Dominic. This great comment and question. I will answer, I first talk about the role of RA. I mean, it's a pity that I probably will never find, I hope I will find more answers. There's a lot of loose threads and a lot of puzzles and silence and void, which I did talk about in the book. And by the way, I have a bounded proof from Cambridge University Press. So I talked to Mr. Huang Jieshan on the phone. He told me that Miss Chen, like spoke very good, fluent spoken English because she worked at some households, American people's households at the time, and then she was one who took a notebook. That's why children remember this Miss Chen following them around notebook, and she, of course, she had to learn the Chinese writing, so she took notes in Chinese writing, and then she repeated to Marjorie Wolf in English, and then Marjorie Wolf typed up most of the notes, and Arthur sometimes also did type up. I can see the signature APW, but it still remains a puzzle, like how fluent or how is that possible? Or sometimes maybe she just explained to Marjorie Wolf in Mandarin and who was translating. So that's, I really wish, and I will want to learn more once I visit Taiwan. And she definitely didn't stay in research. I don't know where she is. I probably should. Last year I asked the landlord's son, and he said he does remember that particular research system, but he doesn't know where she is. Maybe I would find out more. There actually is a couple of other research assistants that so Arthur mentioned two women. There's Miss Chen and Miss MS, Miss Ma Lao Shi. Yeah. But then on the photos, which I only got hold of earlier this year, last year in May, I visited the ranch again. There's another woman. There's a three. so there's always some new puzzles, which is. But going back to your comment on AI and child, it is good, but it is also bad. The good thing is, yes, I think Alan Turing once said that children's minds are just notebooks. You can just write on them as if you are writing computer programs on empty, I don't know, hardware. But no, children's minds are not like that. That's why computer scientists these days, they are collaborating with psychologists a lot. And the good thing is, yes, they're maybe fundamentally different. And there are a lot of researchers doing that research. The kind of data children are exposed, infants are exposed are different. I have seen recent research, ingenious methodology, having newborns mount the camera on the head and trace the world they see is very different from what we have imagined. And those are optimal and perfectly suitable for children to learn about the visual world and other things. So the training data is very different from language models, and the machinery is very different too, as I talked a little bit on. But AI is catching up as crazy as monsters, and they're out-competing humans in many tasks, including some of the moral psychology tasks. There was a paper maybe a couple years ago that shows that the standard moral psychology tests and the AI can get it right, or at the human level of 98 or 95, some range between that, and it's scary. But you don't know why exactly they can be so good. It might be just that they take in a lot of data, including psychologists published papers, and then they know how to repeat the answer. And the silver lining is, at least in that paper, it still shows that AI got stuck on some of the, even though it's a very low percentage, but it is the beauty of, I don't know, human nature, is dilemmas, moral dilemmas. They got stumbled, but then I don't know, maybe they're catching up, at a huge speed that we can never even make sense of. So we might all lose our jobs in the end, and then, yeah. But I shouldn't end on that note. We have a lot of work to do, and that's why I'm using these methods, and especially urging cultural anthropologists to maybe join this conversation. I believe we have important insights, both to learn from the other disciplines, also to contribute.
So Professor Zhang's question, because she's an education background. So the first question is about whether, how is the research shed light on the child learning about morality? And the second question is how to compare that with the Western theory about morality, or the comparison to Western perspective on morality.
Yeah, thank you. These are huge questions, but they are fundamental in my scholarship and trajectory. don't know where to start, but maybe I can just simply respond. First of all, I want to clarify, I can by no means find the answer for what is morality from, I don't know, Aristotle to Confucius. They have argued for thousands of years, and now moral psychologists, now computer scientists, and making, you know, ethical AI and whatnot. So it's not gonna, nobody's gonna find the ultimate answer unless you are God, creator. But the thing is, these are important debates that studying child development does shed unique light on. For example, in my training has several, I'm all over the place, so it's hard to define, but in terms of moral developmental psychology, in the past 2 decades, that was right about I started graduate school in 2008. I was fascinated by the new findings coming from psychology labs looking at infants. Can they tell right and wrong, helper and hinderer, sense of fairness, and comforting and all that, a lot of things. That's why I came here to do a postdoc in psychology. It is really, really fascinating. I mean, it is hard to say if infants at that, I don't know, 1 year old can really know justice in the right and wrong, but there are a lot of alternative explanations. But the scholarship cumulatively has told us that young children, even from infancy, have kind of rudimentary moral senses already, which is very different from the picture anthropologists are taught by, I don't know, Piaget or some other theorists. So that is my entry point to morality. Then at the same time, when I entered graduate school, there is sort of a new anthropology of morality and ethics that was just taking shape. So there was that. That was the looking at the very diverse forms of human morality, or even different definitions, or even different frameworks of what it means to be moral. Are you looking at freedom, liberty, or are you looking at 人伦, human relations? And it's just the very different frameworks look at morality. And of course, there's enormous debates in moral philosophy. So there's a lot of different ways to look at this issue. And within developmental psychology, the issue is nativism versus constructivism. And that's a never-ending debate. But people's knowledge has become much more sophisticated than, let's say, 2 decades ago. And then in the last 10 years, a lot of the psychologists have been collaborating with evolutionary anthropologists. They bring experiments across cultures and to see the differences and similarities. And that approach has produced a lot of interesting results, but also suffered from many things. And one of the issues you mentioned is the sort of theoretical apparatus is very Western-centric, right? The concepts you brought in and what exactly you get from the experiments, how do we interpret that? So I have been, in the last decade, since my first book, been in conversation with psychologists, conferences, workshops. There's always these kinds of debates going on. And in my first book, I study preschool children in China. The reciprocity is such a big thing for Chinese kids, even little kids. They know guanxi and all that. And what kind of morality is that? And moral psychologists, how do you approach that question? And also in this project, when I developed those behavioral themes, part of the inspiration is from existing standard orthodox developmental psychology literature looking at, you know, pro-social development, aggression, all that. But there are certain categories that are very locally salient and bottom-up, and that is the ethnographic way to look at things. For example, throwing a dirty eye. I have that category because we found that in the notes. And what I found through quantitative analysis is more of a girl strategy. So there's a gender bias. Girls were throwing dirty eye more than boys may be using verbal aggression or cursing or physical aggression. So so there are categories like that were emerging from the data itself. And to put it back, yes, I think I've been constantly engaged in conversation with psychologists to, one, from my anthropology background, looking at pluralistic world of morality and ethics, but we all share some certain fundamental common categories of like care, of respect, and other things. I mean, different different prominent moral psychological theories have different categorizations, but my view, as I expressed in some articles before and in this book, is there is the deep roots of human morality, but it is also fundamentally pluralistic. And I think I maybe I have covered that background, but this is a never-ending journey, and it will only get more complicated as we're all grappling with fundamentally, I don't know, different moral worldviews in the U.S. and in elsewhere. Yeah.
So the question is, how about the age range of the children being studied at a time? And then if that observation is upon adults, would that be a similar or different result of that?
Yeah, thank you. Let me clarify. It is 16,000, 100, not gazillion or 1,000. Yeah, that will take my lifetime or more, even with AI. Also, I want to just clarify, in terms of AI, we used SBIRD because this is not ChatGPT. It's not a black box. It's open access. So I don't want to feed Preston's data to, ChatGPT because you don't know what it's doing. There's a lot of, yeah. But in terms of age, I think I touched a little bit in sibling chapter mostly, but this paper, you can find all the fancy graphs made by the biostatistician student. She's now in the East Coast, about age effects. Age, we checked. I mean, this kind of modeling is very complicated to explain its logic. It's Bayesian, multinomial, multi-level modeling. You have to choose multiple competing models and find the approximately best model and whatnot. But the gist is, age overall has a stronger effect than household, whether you are siblings or whether you're from different households, and gender. Of course, it manifests differently in specific behaviors because we also cover a lot of behaviors. For example, aggression. The toddlers were very very aggressive. If you control all other variables, you find that in terms of physical aggression, the toddlers and 3-year-olds, they are. But then the older one, they use more other kinds of dominating strategies rather than pure force. And another, like, there's also comforting. For example, child come to whine and this older child comfort. So that happens a lot within sibling diet, and also there's an age gap. Also dominance, for example, as I remember, it tends to be older children dominating younger children. In contrary to what Marjorie Wolf mentioned in the child training, the yielding, the older brother is supposed to always yield to the younger brother, and in reality is more complicated. So there is I think only the very most sophisticated and cutting-edge statistical modeling can tell us. Even that is just an approximation. About adults, I have to be curious to know the answer to that question myself, because I have so far mainly studied children. The beauty of studying children, they surprise you. I mean, they're also straightforward. If they don't like you, they will let you know they don't like you, but they also surprise you. There's a certain charm that is very inexplicable to me, that always draws me to children. I think, in speaking of otherness, in anthropology, we try to study other group, and for me, children it has that sort of otherness, because we all grew up from our childhood, but we forget, for fabulous evolutionary reasons. And as parents, you also get puzzled by your own children's becoming into an adult. So I think the short answer is, I don't know how it would be. I think it will be hard, because even children are already so conscious of the fact that they are being observed, they are being interviewed, they are sensitive to all these cues. With adults, it just adds more complexity for you how to. But every method, in my opinion, every method is useful and helpful. It's just a matter of how you combine different methods and we be conscious of our own biases, what that particular data might mean in that context. I think there maybe in evolutionary anthropology doing more of the sort of systematic observations now. These days, cultural anthropologists, we tend to mainly interview, right? So I think each method has its own merits. If you interview an adult can tell you a lot. From I use the issue of attachment as an example. I explained in the previous panel that I would love to look more into the issue of attachment, but these knows children's behavior itself. It doesn't tell much about the complex thing of attachment. But if you interview an adult, you would say a lot more about your childhood and your experience. Actually, I read one episode from General G Notes. Those are about adults. They interview adults. This is also Arthur Wolf's field notes in the same field trip, but I have yet to have found a chance to analyze. Actually, the brilliant research assistant Sean is here. He was doing proofreading, and one episode really struck me. This adult woman, she was being interviewed. She talked about her experience giving away her daughters at 12 months old. And she said she gave away a few. She said the second daughter she gave away, the little girl still comes back to play in her household, to play with her biological siblings. And this woman was lamenting, the girl, she likes playing with her siblings, but she doesn't like me. I don't know why she doesn't like me. She was given away at age 1. What does she remember? She keeps saying those are her siblings, but I am not her mother. And it's like it's very sad to read that, but only an adult in recollection can tell you, and we anthropologists can quote that sort of data. So
the question is, how does Dr. Xu compare in between her two books, and also the gradual complexity adding from child development into the description in the two books or her own observation?
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Steve. I think you brought up that angle, like how do I connect or compare the two books or two projects, which is very different temporal, spatial, and political contexts, and economic contexts. My first book studies a private preschool in Pudong District, Shanghai. I did fieldwork from 2011 to 2012. Also, my own child, he was a toddler, so he was one of the protagonist. I wouldn't say protagonist, but he was one of the informants in the preschool. He cost me a lot, which is I couldn't observe his class at all. So there is the cost to that. And my second book is in this context. In terms of age progression, let me just explain a little bit what Steve meant by, what I found in the Chinese preschool. Is that this idea of, for example, this idea of 表现好. I don't know how you say that in Minnan Taiwanese. It is socialized from a very, very young age, which I argue has to be based on certain psychological inclinations that we all have to impress and all that, the authority. But then the older children, they are getting more sophisticated, and they're getting more channeled, narrowed down to being good academics. That defines your moral worth at age 5 already, and these days maybe at age 3 in Shanghai or even younger. So that's the sort of finding Steve talked about. And in this book, I think I didn't put age as this book, I have to say, there are fundamentally two different types of projects. Whenever I present this book, the data, to anthropology audience, I presented at WashU. I remember my professors in my old department, they were all amazed and feel guilty that I can never do field work as good as this, can never produce field notes as systematic and rich as that. I said, me neither, I can. So that's why it's a once in a lifetime opportunity, because I will never produce the kind of field notes that I've had an opportunity to work on in this project. So because of the massive amount of data and how I have to structure my book, the logic and the arguments I want to highlight, there are certain things that didn't get to be presented in the book. But the modeling paper, age, for example, the age progression, which is hard to really explain just ethnographically, But I hope that coupled with social network analysis, which I'm collaborating with evolutionary anthropologists based in the Netherlands, we try to write more systematic stuff out of that, because we have the opportunity to do the super scientifically rigorous, paying tribute to Arthur, and to say more about that. But that being said, I think these two projects definitely they speak to each other. For me personally, because studying moral development, I think in the previous project, I have to say, I came with more sort of theoretical. I already have a set of concepts that I went into the field. That's the dissertation project. Everybody was like, we have to imagine fieldwork goes like you have all these theoretical questions, and then the answers just came out seamlessly, smoothly from the field. It doesn't work like that. But still, I had a little bit more of I brought in, certain theoretical concerns, as I mentioned in the debates of morality and all that, into the fieldwork. Whereas this one, I really have to start from the text. That's the only ultimate thing I can resort to. That's not to deny that I don't have any theoretical sensibilities coming into this project, but it's a different sort of trajectory. And the reason eventually I settled down the title as Unruly in quotation marks is because when I was just reading these field notes, the children were so naughty. And that's the most important impression I got, because I would assume, oh, this traditional society, they're being scolded and spanked and beaten up. They will be very obedient. And that's the impression I got from being a Han Chinese daughter and imagining about those so-called traditional societies. But then it's not like that. They're like 2-year-olds already swearing like crazy, and they were arguing back against their parents. I mean, maybe the intensity is different from my son, American teenager, but they do argue back. Even the little girls. I have one chapter on gender, which is sort of looking at the ignored question of gender in childhood, the sort of different moralities. And one girl is called Iron Teeth because she constantly argues and there's so it's just amazing. And I learned, I think it's such a humbling experience that in the future, that's what I'm gonna do. It's less of a theoretical constraint and whatnot, and really coming more from the ground, from the data we have, from the reality we're exposed to, which goes back to Dominic's question earlier in the earlier panel.
So the questions are, how would they study a Taiwanese or martial law period study? And also, how would you respond to people saying, how do you read children's mind when you're a researcher? Is this your opinion or actually their opinion?
Right. Those are great, profound, almost unanswered. I mean, I try to provide some of my preliminary thoughts. How does become a Taiwan story? I think I have scattered in, I think, the gender chapter, also in the pure play chapter. You see that in children's play, they reenact a lot of the local rituals and I think I have to ask Steve, like, they were doing God's procession, walking backwards, and that sort of thing. And they were playing like banquets of two hosts, they're fighting for one guest. I mean, that is like, I don't know, Taiwanese or Han or, more general, because that is not unfamiliar to me, as a child, but there's some sort of a distance. So there's a lot of the sort of local customs and rituals that were, you see, enacted, but in a very creative way. It's not just pure imitation, mimicking in children's play. And it is simultaneously from those details, I think that is the charm of studying children, that it is also a martial law era Taiwan story, because you see they're playing police catch gamblers. And some children really got scared, even though so the children, the parents, they were gambling. This is not really serious gambling. I see that in Chinese countryside, or the mahjong, or the paper cards, and the adults were playing in the main room. The children were playing in the bedroom, And then so somebody knocked at the door, the police is coming, and some toddler got really scared and started crying. So there are a lot of reenactment of policing. I learned a lot, and including, I saw some of that in Barbara's book. They are coming to inspect cleaning and hygiene. And this is a very historical thing in that particular context. And the children, if you argue that children's minds are just a black box, they're not. You can see that they were, I don't like this metaphor absorbing. They're not sponge absorbing. They have a very sophisticated whatever apparatus here in the brain, which is constantly in interaction with the informational environment and cannot be entirely separated into two realms. But there are a lot of things like that in the notes that lead me interested in the martial law era story. And one particular movie that, because I was struggling, I'm an ethnographer, how do I get into this world? There are numbers. These are like 172 and 7. And of course, there will be unsolved and mysteries and puzzles, or some of them will not be solved, forever. But there is some sort of approximation of whatever partial truths we get. For example, I loved Yang Dechang's movie 孤岭街少年杀人事件. So it's Edward Yang, a famous Taiwanese director, one of the most brilliant epic movies in human history, about a bright summer day is the English title, and echoing Elvis Mao. Yeah. So the movie partially got me into that world, because it was a mainlander, 外省人, right? The movie is about 外省人, but it's about the first juvenile murder case in martial law Taiwan, and it happened in a city in Taipei. It was just 30 minutes by train from Xiaxizhou, and it's the summer of 1960. It's the last summer Arthur was staying in that first trip. So, I mean, the original incident was based on and it is so realistic. You see the American soldiers and military trucks on the street, and you see the Kuomintang, I don't know, flags and symbols everywhere. You see their teachers were wearing military uniform, 教官 and all that. And so that's those sort of medium visual materials really helped me to get a little bit more into that historical context. And I do see that reflected in the notes. And that's something I do absolutely want to explore more in this and subsequent trips, is growing up in that political atmosphere and context. I mentioned that boys, they said bad boys will become 流氓. I mean, in Minnan, how do you say 流氓? Yeah, and I talk about that in the gender chapter. And they also talk about gangsters. And one thing I have to mention, this echoes back to the intellectual history and the relationship with the political environment. Because at that time, researchers were, political socialization was not even a thing. And it started later. And the anthropologists who went to fieldwork, as Steve mentioned in your golden age chapter, they were not interested in school as an institution for subjectivity formation and control. So there, in Arthur's notes, there are like more than 200 episodes that were observed in schools. And I would love to see, okay, what kind of messages are they learning? But then the episodes are more about discipline, like, oh, this child, he cannot write a Chinese character, and then he got scolded and started crying. It's also very interesting, but there's something that, because of the constraints of the time, that we don't have in that particular data set. That is, and I wanted to learn more from other angles and to complement. I'm sure there are a lot of textbooks and you can study in that period, but it's different from observing a classroom in real time. Right, I think I will stop there.
So thank you, Dr. Xu, for this wonderful and very profound study on that. We see the very advanced AI comparison of the child rearing data, but also bring us back to the pre-TV time. I assume those kids are enacting themselves in the playful performance before they can really focus on TV. That's great.
Right.
So let's have a great applause around to the
Thank
participants.
you. Thank you very
And
much.
thank you for coming to Taiwan and study book talk series.
Thank you.